The old Georgetown courthouse stood like a weathered sentinel amid the sprawling modernity of Washington, D.C., its red brick facade darkened by decades of urban exhaust and acid rain. Inside courtroom 4, Judge Olivia Harrington adjusted her black robe, feeling its weight settle on her shoulders like armor. 20 years on the bench had taught her that justice was rarely as clear-cut as the marble columns flanking the entrance suggested. The April morning filtered weak sunlight through tall windows, casting sharp rectangles across the polished oak of the judge's bench. To Olivia's right, the American flag hung in perfect calculated folds. To her left, the District of Columbia flag mirrored its stillness. The courtroom hummed with the familiar symphony of preparation, the soft rustle of files being arranged by her clerk, the whispered consultations between attorneys and their clients, the occasional cough that seemed to ricochet off the high ceiling. "All rise," announced Bailiff Martinez, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had spoken these same words thousands of times. "The Superior Court of the District of Columbia is now in session, the Honorable Judge Olivia Harrington presiding." Olivia scanned the room, nodding almost imperceptibly as she took her seat. "Be seated," she said, her voice measured and clear. She glanced at the docket before her, District of Columbia versus Marcus Washington. Armed robbery, assault on a store clerk, resisting arrest. The familiar disappointment rose in her chest, another life potentially lost to the system. She had presided over hundreds of such cases, had sentenced so many young men and women to years behind bars, always wondering if justice was truly being served or merely processed, like paperwork. The statistics haunted her, the disproportionate number of black and brown defendants, the cyclical nature of poverty and crime, the staggering recidivism rates. She tried to maintain her professional detachment, but some days it felt like bailing out a sinking ship with a teacup. "Bring in the defendant," she instructed, straightening her posture. The side door opened, and 2 court officers led in a man in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled. Standard procedure, but it always struck Olivia as excessive theater, a visual reinforcement of guilt before any verdict was reached. The man was tall but stooped, as if life had placed an invisible weight upon his shoulders. His close-cropped hair showed flecks of gray, his face weathered by years Olivia couldn't account for. Then he raised his head, and Olivia felt the world shift beneath her. Those eyes, dark brown, almost black, with a distinctive light fleck in the left iris. Eyes that had once sparkled with mischief and determination under the boughs of an old oak tree at the edge of Meridian Hill Park, in a world that existed a lifetime ago. Marcus Washington was Marcus from her childhood, her Marcus. The boy who had taught her to skip stones across Rock Creek, who had shared his grandmother's sweet potato pie with her on crisp autumn afternoons, who had promised they would change the world together someday. The recognition slammed into her like a physical blow. Her hand instinctively tightened around her gavel, and for the first time in her career, Olivia felt unsure of what to do next. Everything in the room seemed to recede, the sounds dampening as if she were underwater. Only Marcus remained in sharp focus, though he had yet to look directly at her. "Judge Harrington?" Her clerk's voice, tinged with concern, pulled her back to the present. "Yes, proceed," she managed, her voice steady despite the tumult within. Years of judicial training had taught her to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from duty. She would need every ounce of that discipline now. "Mr. Washington," she began, the name feeling strange on her tongue after all these years. "You are charged with armed robbery, assault, and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" Marcus finally looked up, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned in his eyes, a slight widening, a barely perceptible intake of breath, but just as quickly he looked away, shoulders slumping further. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he replied, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar, as if he hadn't used it in some time. Olivia nodded, forcing herself to proceed with the routine of the arraignment. "Bail hearing is set for tomorrow morning. We'll reconvene then." As Marcus was led away, Olivia caught herself wanting to call out, to stop the proceedings, to ask him what had happened in the decades since they'd last seen each other. How had their paths diverged so dramatically, from the same neighborhood to opposite sides of her bench? But the role of judge demanded she remain impartial, distant. Any personal connection could compromise the entire case. When the courtroom emptied, Olivia remained seated, staring at the space where Marcus had stood. Her mind reeled back to sun-dappled days in the summer of 1983, when Washington, D.C. was a different city and they were different people. The summer of '83 had been unusually hot, the air thick with humidity that seemed to trap the city's sounds and smells. 13-year-old Olivia Chambers, as she was then, had escaped the suffocating atmosphere of her family's row house in Columbia Heights, seeking refuge in the relative cool of Meridian Hill Park. Her mother was working a double shift at Howard University Hospital, and her father was, as usual, buried in legal briefs at his downtown office. The house was empty, but somehow still felt too full of expectations, of the weight of being the only child of two high-achieving professionals. She wore cut-off jean shorts and a purple tank top with rainbow stripes, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that swung as she walked. In her backpack was a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a signed summer reading, but she was genuinely engrossed in it. Atticus Finch reminded her of her father, principled, respected, distant. The park was a mosaic of humanity that day. Georgetown University students sprawled on blankets pretending to study. Elderly men played chess at concrete tables, their moves deliberate and unhurried. Rastafarians drummed near the cascading fountain, the rhythm pulsing like a heartbeat through the park. Olivia found a quiet spot under a massive oak tree, its branches creating a canopy of shade. She had just opened her book when a voice interrupted her. "You reading that 'cause you want to, or 'cause someone's making you?" She looked up to see a boy about her age, maybe a little older, standing a few feet away. He wore faded jeans and a Washington Redskins t-shirt that had seen better days. His sneakers were scuffed but clean, meticulously maintained despite their age. "Both," she answered honestly. "It's for school, but I like it." The boy nodded as if her answer satisfied some internal question. "My teacher tried to get me to read that last year. I made it halfway." "It gets better," Olivia offered, marking her page and closing the book. He shrugged. "Maybe. I'm Marcus, by the way. Marcus Washington." "Olivia Chambers." He sat down near her, not too close, but close enough to talk without shouting. "You live around here?" "Columbia Heights, on Newton Street." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "For real? That's like 3 blocks from me. How come I never seen you at Cardozo?" "I go to Sidwell Friends," she said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Sidwell was a prestigious private school worlds away from the public Cardozo High School. "Fancy," he commented, but without the edge of resentment she sometimes got from neighborhood kids. "Your folks lawyers or doctors?" "Dad's a lawyer, Mom's a nurse at Howard." Marcus nodded again. "My grandma was a nurse before she got sick." This was how it began, a chance encounter, a simple conversation. They discovered they both liked the Smithsonian museums, but avoided the touristy parts of the mall. They had both seen Return of the Jedi that summer and agreed that Ewoks were kinda lame. They both knew what it was like to come home to an empty house most days. As the afternoon waned, Marcus taught her how to skip stones across the park's fountain pool when the guards weren't looking. "It's all in the wrist," he explained, demonstrating the fluid motion. "And you gotta find just the right stone, flat, but with some weight to it." Olivia's first attempts sank immediately, but by the 5th try she managed to get a stone to skip twice before disappearing beneath the water's surface. "See?" Marcus grinned. "Natural talent." When they parted ways that day, there was no formal agreement to meet again, but both knew they would, and so began a summer of secret adventures. They explored abandoned buildings on the edges of their neighborhoods, careful to avoid the areas where drug deals went down. They spent hours in the free museums, making up stories about the people in the paintings. They shared popsicles that dripped sticky trails down their arms in the relentless heat. Marcus was different from the boys at Sidwell, who seemed already shaped by their parents' expectations, already on paths toward Ivy League schools and careers in law, medicine, or politics. He was free in a way they weren't, but also burdened in ways they couldn't imagine. "My dad's gone," he told her one afternoon as they sat on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, watching tourists take photos. "Left when I was 4. Don't remember much about him." "I'm sorry," Olivia said, meaning it. Marcus shrugged, but his eyes told a different story. "Mom works 2 jobs. I stay with my grandma most days. She's got diabetes real bad. Sometimes I gotta help her with her insulin." Ew. Olivia nodded, unsure what to say. Her parents were distant, but present. Her home was quiet, but secure. She'd never had to worry about adult responsibilities like caring for a sick grandparent or wondering where the next meal would come from. "You ever think about leaving DC?" Marcus asked her one evening as they watched the sunset from the hill in the park. "Just going somewhere else?" Somewhere people don't look at us funny when they see us together? Olivia had noticed the looks, from older residents, from police officers who slowed their patrol cars when passing, from the occasional group of teenagers who snickered and whispered. A black boy and a white girl, just friends. But in D.C., in 1983, that was still enough to raise eyebrows. "Where would we go?" she asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know. New York, maybe. Or California. Somewhere bigger, where people mind their own business." "We'd need money," Olivia pointed out, practical even then. Marcus lay back on the grass, hands behind his head. "I'm gonna have money someday. Gonna start my own business. Something with computers, maybe. My teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, says that's where the future is." "What kind of business?" "Don't know yet, but something that helps people. Makes things better, you know?" Olivia did know. Despite their different circumstances, they shared this, a belief that the world could be improved and that they might have a hand in improving it. The summer stretched on, golden and seemingly endless, until the evening Olivia's father caught them sitting on the front steps of the Chambers family home, sharing a bag of chips and laughing about a movie they'd just described to each other, neither having seen it, but both pretending they had. Richard Chambers stepped out of his BMW, briefcase in hand, and froze at the sight of them. His gaze traveled from his daughter to Marcus and back again, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder, colder. "Olivia," he said, his tone clipped. "Inside, now." "Dad, this is my friend." "Now, Olivia." She hesitated, looking at Marcus, who had already stood up, his body language suddenly guarded, closed off. "It's cool," he said quietly. "I should get home anyway. Grandma's waiting." "I'll see you tomorrow?" Olivia asked, hating the pleading note in her voice. Marcus glanced at her father, then back at her. "Yeah," he said, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't sure. "See you around, Liv." But she didn't see him the next day, or the day after, or any day for the rest of the summer. When school started again in September, she went back to Sidwell, to her classmates with their designer clothes and summer stories about the Hamptons or Europe. She looked for Marcus at the park on weekends, but he was never there. It wasn't until October that she learned from a neighborhood girl that the Washingtons had moved. Marcus's grandmother had been placed in a nursing home in Baltimore, and he and his mother had relocated to be near her. No forwarding address, no goodbye. Olivia had cried that night, silently into her pillow so her parents wouldn't hear. She'd lost something precious that summer. Not just a friend, but a window into a different kind of life, a different way of seeing the world. Marcus had shown her parts of D.C. she'd never known existed, had taught her that courage sometimes meant facing each day, despite not knowing what it would bring. Now, 37 years later, Marcus Washington sat across from her in a courtroom, accused of crimes that could send him to prison for a decade or more. The irony wasn't lost on Olivia. She, who had once idolized Atticus Finch, now presided over a system that seemed designed to ensnare people like Marcus. The morning after the arraignment, Olivia arrived at her chambers earlier than usual. Her assistant, Rachel Kim, was already there, organizing the day's files with her customary efficiency. "You're here early," Rachel remarked, handing Olivia a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, just as she preferred. "Couldn't sleep," Olivia admitted, taking the cup gratefully. "Thank you for this." Rachel hesitated, then said, "Judge, if you don't mind my saying, you seemed off yesterday during the Washington arraignment. Is everything okay?" Olivia considered her options. Rachel had been with her for 8 years, was discreet and loyal, but revealing her connection to Marcus could potentially create complications. "I'm fine," she replied finally. "Just one of those days when the weight of the job feels a bit heavier." Rachel nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to push. "The bail hearing is at 10. Prosecution is asking for no bail, citing flight risk and the violent nature of the alleged crime." "And the defense?" "Public defender Sarah Chen. She'll argue for release on personal recognizance or minimal bail, first-time violent offense, ties to the community, etc." Olivia nodded, trying to focus on the legal aspects rather than the image of young Marcus teaching her to skip stones. "What's his record look like?" Rachel consulted a file. "Misdemeanors mostly, shoplifting as a juvenile, trespassing, a couple of marijuana possessions before the decriminalization, nothing in the last 5 years. Not the profile of a hardened criminal," Olivia thought. But the charges he faced now were serious. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, resisting arrest. The prosecution's file alleged that Marcus had entered a convenience store in Foggy Bottom, brandished a knife, demanded money, then struck the clerk when he tried to activate the silent alarm. He was apprehended 2 blocks away, allegedly still in possession of the stolen cash. The bail hearing proceeded as expected. Assistant District Attorney Victor Reynolds, a sharp-dressed man with a reputation for aggressive prosecution, argued that Marcus posed a threat to public safety and had limited ties to the community that would prevent him from fleeing. "Your Honor," Reynolds said, his voice resonating with practiced conviction, "the defendant was apprehended mere blocks from the scene of a violent crime, with the stolen money still in his possession. The victim suffered a laceration requiring 15 stitches. The community deserves protection from such wanton disregard for law and safety." Sarah Chen, the public defender, was younger but no less determined. Her navy suit was less expensive than Reynolds', her briefcase more worn, but her eyes burned with the same intensity Olivia had once seen in law students who still believed the system could work for everyone. "Your Honor," Chen countered, "Mr. Washington has maintained a stable residence in the district for the past 7 years. He's been employed at the same automotive repair shop for 5 years, as his boss Mr. Rodriguez will attest." She gestured to a middle-aged Hispanic man sitting in the gallery. "He has no prior violent offenses and vehemently denies the current charges. The prosecution's case relies heavily on circumstantial evidence and a witness identification made under stress in poor lighting conditions." Duo. Olivia listened, acutely aware of Marcus sitting at the defense table. He wore the standard-issue jumpsuit, his hands folded in front of him. He looked older than his 50 years, the lines around his eyes and mouth speaking of hardships she could only imagine. When it came time for her decision, Olivia weighed the factors carefully. The charges were serious, but the evidence as presented seemed circumstantial. Marcus had ties to the community and a job. The standard procedure would be to set bail high enough to ensure his return, but not so prohibitively high as to constitute de facto detention. "Bail is set at $50,000, she ruled finally. "The defendant will surrender his passport and is to have no contact with the alleged victim or the establishment where the incident occurred." It was a compromise, lower than what the prosecution wanted, higher than what the defense had hoped for. Reynolds looked displeased, but unsurprised. Chen whispered something to Marcus, who nodded without visible reaction. As he was led away, Marcus finally looked directly at Olivia. There was no hostility in his gaze, no plea for special treatment. Just a profound weariness and something else, recognition certainly, but also a kind of resignation, as if he'd long ago accepted that this was how their paths would eventually cross again. The trial was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. Olivia knew she should recuse herself. Her personal knowledge of the defendant, however distant in time, created a clear conflict of interest. But recusal would require explanation, and explanation would bring scrutiny to the case, to Marcus, to herself. The media would seize on it. Judge steps down after recognizing accused robber as childhood friend. The story would become about them, not about justice. And there was something else, something she was reluctant to admit even to herself. She wanted to ensure Marcus received a fair trial. She'd seen too many cases where defendants like him were presumed guilty from the start, where overworked public defenders couldn't match the resources of the prosecution, where judges rubber-stamped harsh sentences for the sake of appearing tough on crime. If she stayed on the case, she could ensure procedural fairness while maintaining her judicial impartiality. She would rule on the evidence presented, nothing more, nothing less. It was a rationalization, perhaps, but one she could live with, for now. The pretrial days passed in a blur of motions, hearings, and administrative details. Olivia maintained her professional demeanor, but privately, she found herself revisiting memories of that long-ago summer. She remembered Marcus's laugh, his determination, his dreams of starting a business that would help people. What had happened to that boy? How had he ended up here, accused of armed robbery? She considered reaching out to him somehow, but every ethical guideline she'd ever learned screamed against it. Instead, she did something she'd never done before. She ran a background check. Not through official channels, that would leave a trace, but through a private investigator friend who owed her a favor. She told herself it was to better understand the case to ensure justice was served. The truth was more complicated. The report came back 3 days later, delivered in a plain manila envelope to her home address. Olivia waited until she was alone, a glass of red wine at her elbow before opening it. Marcus Washington had indeed moved to Baltimore in 1983 with his mother Denise to be near his grandmother in a nursing facility. He'd attended Patterson High School, where his records showed average grades but excellent attendance. His grandmother died in 1986, and he and his mother returned to D.C. shortly after. He enrolled at Cardozo, but dropped out in his senior year when his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. The following years showed a pattern familiar to Olivia from countless case files: sporadic employment, minor brushes with the law, a couple of stints in juvenile detention for shoplifting and trespassing. Then at 23, a turning point, enrollment in a GED program, followed by community college courses in automotive technology, a steady job at a garage in Shaw, marriage to Letitia Johnson in 1997. Then more hardship. His mother's cancer returned in 2002, terminal this time. Medical bills mounted. Bankruptcy filing in 2003, divorce in 2005, a DUI in 2008, followed by mandatory substance abuse counseling. But then stability again. Sobriety, steady employment at Rodriguez Auto Repair since 2015, a small apartment in a gentrifying part of Anacostia. Nothing in the report suggested a man who would suddenly commit armed robbery. If anything, it painted a picture of someone who had faced tremendous challenges, but had repeatedly found his way back to stability. Someone who had made mistakes, but had worked to overcome them. The last page of the report included a current address and a phone number. Olivia stared at these details for a long time before carefully burning the entire report in her fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. The morning the trial was set to begin, Olivia arrived at the courthouse to find a small crowd of protesters on the steps, holding signs that read, "Justice for All" and "End Mass Incarceration." It wasn't unusual. Criminal justice reform had gained momentum in recent years, but it added an extra layer of tension to the proceedings. Inside, the courtroom was packed. High-profile cases always drew spectators, and armed robbery in an affluent neighborhood qualified as newsworthy in D.C. Olivia spotted a few reporters she recognized, notebooks at the ready. As she entered, everyone rose. She took her seat, feeling the weight of all eyes upon her. "Be seated," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Are both sides ready to proceed with opening statements?" Reynolds stood first. "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor." Chen followed. "Defense is ready, Your Honor." Marcus sat beside Chen, now dressed in a suit that seemed slightly too large for him, borrowed, perhaps, or purchased hastily for the occasion. His expression was stoic, but Olivia noticed the way his fingers tapped nervously against the table. "Very well," she said. "Mr. Reynolds, you may begin." Reynolds approached the jury, his stance confident, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store, threatened a hard-working clerk with a knife, and stole money from the register. When the clerk, Ali Nazari, attempted to activate the silent alarm, the defendant struck him, causing a wound that required 15 stitches to close. He paced before them, making eye contact with each juror in turn. The evidence will show that Marcus Washington was apprehended just 2 blocks from the scene, with over $200 in small bills on his person, the exact amount missing from the register. Mr. Nazari positively identified him as the assailant. The security camera footage, though grainy, shows a man of Mr. Washington's height and build committing the robbery. The case, ladies and gentlemen, is clear-cut. At the conclusion of this trial, we ask that you find the defendant guilty on all counts. Chen's opening statement offered a starkly different narrative. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice quieter than Reynolds's but no less intense. "This case is about mistaken identity. It's about a man who was simply walking home from a friend's house when police officers stopped him, decided he fit a vague description, and arrested him without proper investigation." She moved closer to the jury box, her manner earnest. "The evidence will show that the convenience store's security footage is of such poor quality that positive identification is impossible. The lighting was dim, and Mr. Nazari, understandably traumatized, made his identification under stressful conditions. The money found on Mr. Washington was his own, cash he had just been paid for helping a friend move furniture that evening." Chen gestured toward Marcus. "My client has maintained steady employment for years. He has worked to overcome past struggles and build a stable life. He has no history of violent crime. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this trial, the only just verdict will be not guilty on all counts." As the opening statements concluded, Olivia called for the prosecution's first witness. Reynolds called Ali Nazari, the convenience store clerk, to the stand. Nazari was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with dark hair and nervous eyes. He took the oath with a slight tremor in his voice, then sat, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Reynolds led him through the events of the night in question. Nazari described how a man had entered the store around 10:30 p.m., browsed briefly, then approached the counter with a knife. He say, "Open the register," Nazari recalled, his accent pronounced but his English clear. "I was scared. I open it. He take the money. When I try to press the alarm button under counter, he hit me with the knife. Here." He touched his left forearm, where a bandage was visible beneath his shirt sleeve. "Did you get a good look at the man who attacked you?" Reynolds asked. "Yes," Nazari nodded. "He wore dark clothes, hood up, but I see his face." "Is that man in the courtroom today?" Nazari scanned the room, then pointed at Marcus. "That is him." "Let the record show the witness has identified the defendant," Reynolds said, then continued. "Mr. Nazari, how certain are you of this identification?" "Very certain," Nazari replied. "I never forget face of man who cut me." When it was Chen's turn to cross-examine, she approached Nazari with a sympathetic expression. "Mr. Nazari, I'm sorry for what happened to you. No one should experience such trauma while simply doing their job." And Nazari nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I'd like to ask you about the lighting conditions in the store that night. The police report indicates that 2 of the overhead lights were non-functional. Is that correct?" "Yes," Nazari admitted. "Owner was supposed to fix, but not yet." "And the man who robbed you had his hood up, correct?" "Yes, but pulled down when he come to counter." "The entire time?" Nazari hesitated. "No." "Maybe not entire time?" Chen nodded. "And you were focused on the knife, weren't you? That would be natural. Anyone would focus on a weapon pointed at them." Yes, I look at knives sometimes." "You mentioned the man wore dark clothes. Can you be more specific about what he was wearing?" Nazari frowned in concentration. "Dark hoodie, black, I think, jeans." "And when the police showed you photos of potential suspects, how many did they show you?" "Just one," Nazari admitted after a pause. Chen raised her eyebrows. "Just one? Not a lineup of multiple people?" "No, they show me picture of him." He pointed at Marcus again, "and ask if this is the man. I say yes." "Thank you, Mr. Nazari. No further questions." Throughout the exchange, Olivia had been watching Marcus. He showed no reaction to being identified as the assailant, no indignation or fear, just that same weary resignation she'd noticed before. The trial continued with testimony from the responding officers. Officer Derek Wilson described finding Marcus 2 blocks from the convenience store, walking at a brisk pace away from the scene. "When we approached the suspect," Wilson testified, "he immediately became defensive, refusing to comply with our orders to put his hands up." "And what happened next?" Reynolds prompted. "He attempted to flee. We pursued on foot and apprehended him after a brief chase. Upon searching his person, we discovered $217 in small bills, consistent with a convenience store robbery." Chen's cross-examination was pointed. "Officer Wilson, you testified that Mr. Washington became defensive. Could you elaborate on what specific behaviors you observed?" Wilson shifted in his seat. "He asked why we were stopping him. He said he hadn't done anything wrong." "So he questioned why he was being detained," Chen clarified. "Is that unusual in your experience as an officer?" "Not unusual, no." "You also stated he attempted to flee. What exactly did he do?" "He turned and began walking rapidly in the opposite direction." "Walking, not running?" Wilson hesitated. "Walking rapidly. Did you identify yourselves as police officers before approaching Mr. Washington?" "We were in uniform, in a marked vehicle." "That wasn't my question. Did you verbally identify yourselves and state the reason for stopping him?" "We called out, 'Police stop,' as we approached." "But you didn't explain why you were stopping him until after he was in custody, correct?" Wilson's jaw tightened. "Correct." Chen continued her methodical dismantling. "Officer Wilson, what description of the suspect were you working with when you stopped Mr. Washington?" "Male, African-American, medium to tall height, dark clothing." "That's a description that could match thousands of men in D.C., isn't it?" "We were responding to a robbery that had just occurred. Mr. Washington was in the vicinity, matching the general description, moving away from the scene." Did you find a knife on Mr. Washington when you searched him? No. Did you find a hoodie, as described by Mr. Nazari? No, he was wearing a dark jacket. So to summarize, you stopped a man based on a vague description that could match many individuals, who was walking, not running, in a public area, who was not in possession of the weapon used in the robbery, and who was not wearing the specific clothing described by the victim. Is that correct? Wilson's expression hardened. We found the stolen money on him. We'll get to that, Chen promised. No further questions for now. As the day progressed, Olivia maintained her judicial demeanor, but internally, questions multiplied. The prosecution's case seemed to rest heavily on Nazari's identification and the money found on Marcus. But identifications were notoriously unreliable, especially under stress and in poor lighting conditions. And the money, while suspicious, could have an innocent explanation. When court adjourned for the day, Olivia retreated to her chambers, declining Rachel's invitation to join her and some of the other staff for drinks. Instead, she drove home alone, the day's proceedings replaying in her mind. That night, she dreamed of the summer of '83, of Marcus teaching her to skip stones, of his serious expression when he talked about his sick grandmother, of the way he'd looked at her father that last day on the steps of her house. In the dream, the scene shifted, and suddenly they were in her courtroom. Marcus stood before her in chains, and she was pronouncing a sentence. But the words wouldn't come. She kept trying to speak, but her voice made no sound. She woke at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, the dream still vivid. Sleep eluded her for the rest of the night. The second day of the trial brought a surprise. As Olivia entered the courtroom, Rachel handed her a note. Defense has added a last-minute witness, Michael Rodriguez, owner of the auto shop where Washington works. Reynolds was already on his feet, objecting. Your Honor, the defense did not include this witness in their initial disclosure. We've had no opportunity to prepare for cross-examination. Chen responded calmly. Mr. Rodriguez only came forward yesterday evening, Your Honor. He was initially reluctant to get involved, but believes he has information directly relevant to Mr. Washington's whereabouts at the time of the robbery. Olivia considered. Late additions to witness lists were generally frowned upon, but judges had discretion to allow them if the testimony could be material and the late disclosure was not tactical. Ms. Chen, approach the bench, she instructed. When both attorneys stood before her, she asked quietly, what precisely does Mr. Rodriguez intend to testify about? He will testify that Mr. Washington was helping him move furniture until approximately 10:15 p.m. on the night in question, and that he paid Mr. Washington $200 in cash for his assistance. This directly accounts for the money found on my client and places him at a location across town just 15 minutes before the robbery allegedly occurred. Reynolds scoffed. Convenient timing. And why didn't this paragon of civic virtue come forward sooner? Mr. Rodriguez was out of town until yesterday on a family emergency. He didn't know about Mr. Washington's arrest until he returned and another employee informed him. Olivia considered the arguments. I'll allow the witness, she decided, but Mr. Reynolds will be given adequate time to prepare cross-examination. We'll hear from Mr. Rodriguez after lunch. Reynolds looked displeased, but nodded. Chen returned to her seat, whispering something to Marcus that made him straighten slightly, a flicker of hope crossing his features. The morning session continued with the prosecution wrapping up its case. The final piece of evidence was the security footage from the convenience store, grainy black and white video showing a hooded figure entering the store, approaching the counter, then leaning forward aggressively. The actual assault occurred just off camera, but the figure could be seen hurriedly exiting moments later. As you can see, Reynolds said, addressing the jury, the build and movement patterns of the individual in this footage are consistent with the defendant. Chen objected immediately. Your Honor, the prosecutor is drawing conclusions that should be left to the jury. The footage is of such poor quality that precise identification is impossible. Sustained, Olivia ruled. The jury will disregard the prosecutor's characterization of the video evidence. They must form their own conclusions based on what they observe. Reynolds nodded curtly and concluded his presentation. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. After a brief recess, the court reconvened for the afternoon session. Michael Rodriguez took the stand, a stocky man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and calloused hands that spoke of decades of mechanical work. He wore a clean but well-worn button-up shirt and tie, clearly his best attempt at formal courtroom attire. After being sworn in, Chen began her questioning. Mr. Rodriguez, how do you know the defendant, Marcus Washington? He's worked at my auto repair shop for the past 5 years, Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying a slight accent. Best diagnostic technician I've ever hired. And what can you tell us about his character? Objection, Reynolds interrupted. Character evidence is not relevant to the specific events of the night in question. Your Honor, Chen countered, the prosecution has implied that Mr. Washington suddenly turned to violent crime despite years of lawful behavior. His character and reputation are directly relevant to evaluating the plausibility of their narrative. Olivia considered briefly. I'll allow limited character testimony. Proceed, Ms. Chen, but keep it focused. Chen nodded. Mr. Rodriguez, please tell the court about Marcus Washington as an employee and person. Rodriguez straightened in his chair. Marcus is reliable, never late, never calls out without good reason. Customers ask for him by name because he's honest, doesn't try to upsell them on repairs they don't need. He's quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but he's always willing to help others in the shop. Now, Mr. Rodriguez, I'd like to direct your attention to the night of April 15th. Did you see Marcus Washington that evening? Yes, I did. I'd just bought a new couch and dining set. My nephew was supposed to help me move the furniture, but his kid got sick. I mentioned it to Marcus that morning, and he offered to help after work. And did he? Yes, he came to my place around 7:30. We had dinner, my wife made arroz con pollo, then we moved the furniture. The delivery guys had just left everything in the front hall, and we needed to get it upstairs to my apartment and arrange it. What time did Marcus leave your home? Around 10:15, maybe 10:20. I remember checking my watch because I was worried about keeping him so late on a work night. And where is your home located, Mr. Rodriguez? Columbia Heights on Monroe Street. Chen nodded. That's approximately 3 miles from the convenience store on Pennsylvania Avenue where the robbery occurred at 10:30 p.m. Now, did you give Marcus anything before he left? Yes, I paid him for helping me, $200 cash. I tried to give him more. It was heavy furniture and we worked for hours, but he wouldn't take it. This money was in what denominations? Mostly 20s, some 10s and 5s. I'd just been to the ATM that morning. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. No further questions. Reynolds approached for cross-examination, his manner skeptical. Mr. Rodriguez, you claim to have been with the defendant until approximately 10:15 p.m. on the night of the robbery, correct? Yes, that's right. Can anyone else corroborate this claim? My wife was there. She served us dinner and helped direct where the furniture should go. Anyone else? Anyone not related to you or dependent on you for their livelihood? Rodriguez frowned. No, just us three. And you didn't come forward with this information until yesterday, nearly a month after Mr. Washington's arrest. Why the delay? I was in Puerto Rico. My mother passed away and I went for the funeral and to help settle her affairs. I didn't know Marcus was in trouble until I got back and my other mechanic, Jamal, told me. I see. And are you and Mr. Washington friends outside of work? Not really. We respect each other, but we don't socialize much. Yeah, and yet you paid him $200 for a few hours of moving furniture? It was heavy work, and he did me a favor on short notice. Reynolds paced briefly, then asked, Mr. Rodriguez, are you aware that if Mr. Washington is convicted, you would have difficulty finding someone with his skills to replace him at your shop? Objection, Chen called out. Counsel is implying the witness has fabricated testimony for business reasons. Sustained, Olivia ruled. Mr. Reynolds, please restrict your questions to relevant matters. Reynolds nodded, then tried another approach. Mr. Rodriguez, did you see Mr. Washington actually leave your building that night? Well, no. I walked him to my door and thanked him again. So you can't say with certainty what he did after leaving your apartment, can you? Rodriguez hesitated. No, I guess not. Chechas. For all you know, he could have gone directly to that convenience store after leaving your place. He wouldn't do that, Rodriguez insisted. That's not who Marcus is. Please answer the question, yes or no. Is it physically possible that the defendant could have reached the convenience store by 10:30 p.m.? Rodriguez frowned. Yes, it's possible. No further questions. Chen stood for a redirect. Mr. Rodriguez, based on your knowledge of Marcus Washington over 5 years of working closely with him, do you believe he would commit armed robbery? Objection, Reynolds called. Calls for speculation. I'll rephrase, Chen said quickly. Mr. Rodriguez, in your 5 years of employing Marcus Washington, has he ever displayed violent tendencies or dishonesty? Never, not once. Thank you, no further questions. When as Rodriguez stepped down, Olivia noticed Marcus watching him with a look of profound gratitude. It was the most emotion he'd displayed since the trial began. The defense called one final witness, Marcus Washington himself. A ripple of anticipation moved through the courtroom as he rose and walked to the witness stand. After being sworn in, he sat straight-backed but visibly nervous, his hands clasped together to prevent them from shaking. Chen began gently. Mr. Washington, where were you on the evening of April 15th? I was at work until 7 o'clock p.m., Marcus replied, his voice deeper than Olivia remembered from their youth, but still with that distinctive, thoughtful cadence. Then I went to Mr. Rodriguez's apartment to help him move some furniture. And what time did you leave his residence? Around 10:15, like he said. I checked my watch because I knew I had an early shift the next day. What did you do after leaving Mr. Rodriguez's apartment? I started walking home. I live in Anacostia, so I was heading to the metro station. That's when the police stopped me. Did they tell you why they were stopping you? Not at first, just yelled for me to put my hands up. I asked what was going on, and they said there'd been a robbery. I told them I was just walking home from helping my boss move furniture. And how did they respond? They didn't believe me. When I tried to get my phone to call Mr. Rodriguez, they thought I was reaching for a weapon. Things escalated from there. Did you resist arrest, as the officers have claimed? Marcus sighed. I didn't fight them, if that's what you're asking. I did try to walk away at first because I hadn't done anything wrong. I've had encounters with police before where things went badly, even when I wasn't doing anything wrong. Mr. Washington, did you rob the convenience store on Pennsylvania Avenue that night? Did you assault Ali Nazari? Marcus looked directly at the jury, his expression solemn. No, ma'am. I have never robbed anyone, and I've never hurt anyone intentionally in my life. Chen nodded. Thank you, Mr. Washington. Reynolds approached for cross-examination, his manner now aggressive. Mr. Washington, you have a prior criminal record, don't you? Yes, Marcus admitted. When I was younger. Please enumerate those convictions for the jury. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Shoplifting when I was 16, trespassing at 19, possession of marijuana in my 20s a couple of times, a DUI in 2008. So you're not unfamiliar with criminal behavior? I made mistakes when I was younger, Marcus acknowledged. I've worked hard to turn my life around since then. You claim the money found on your person was payment from Mr. Rodriguez. Do you have a receipt? Any documentation of this payment? No, it was a cash payment between friends. How convenient. Reynolds paced before the witness stand. Mr. Washington, if you were simply walking home, why were you heading west, away from the metro station that would take you to Anacostia? Marcus frowned. I wasn't heading west. I was heading east on K Street, toward the station. The officers testified they found you 2 blocks west of the convenience store. Then they're mistaken. I was nowhere near that store. Reynolds changed tactics. You mentioned encounters with police in the past. Care to elaborate? Objection, Chen interjected. Irrelevant to the current charges. Your Honor, Reynolds countered, the defendant has made his past interactions with police part of his explanation for his behavior during arrest. I'm entitled to explore that. I'll allow it, Olivia ruled. But keep it relevant, Mr. Reynolds. Reynolds turned back to Marcus. Please answer the question, Mr. Washington. Marcus exhaled slowly. When I was younger, I was stopped by police a lot, usually for no reason. Just walking down the street in my neighborhood. One time, when I was 17, I was slammed against a wall and handcuffed because I matched the description of someone who'd broken into a car. Another time, I was held at gunpoint because someone reported a suspicious person in their neighborhood. I was delivering pizza. So, yeah, when the police approached me that night, I was scared. But you've also had legitimate arrests, haven't you? The ones you already mentioned? Yes. So the police weren't always wrong about you? Marcus met Reynolds' gaze steadily. I'm not claiming to be perfect, sir. I'm just saying I didn't rob that store or hurt that man. Reynolds pressed on, his questions designed to rattle Marcus, to make him appear evasive or aggressive. But Marcus maintained his composure, answering directly and calmly. When Reynolds finally concluded his cross-examination, Olivia could see that some jurors were nodding slightly at Marcus's responses, while others remained skeptical. "Redirect Ms. Chen?" Olivia asked. "Just one question," Chen said, approaching her client. "Ms. Washington, why do you think Mr. Nazari identified you as the person who robbed his store?" "Objection," Reynolds called. "Calls for speculation." "I'll allow it," Olivia ruled. "The witness may answer." Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think he believes what he's saying. Being robbed and attacked is traumatic. Maybe the person who did it looked something like me. Maybe the police showing him just my photo convinced him it was me. I don't think he's lying. I just think he's mistaken." "Thank you, Mr. Washington. No further questions." "The defense rests, Your Honor," Chen announced. Olivia addressed both attorneys. "We'll hear closing arguments tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. As the courtroom emptied, Olivia watched Marcus being led away by court officers. His testimony had been compelling, but would it be enough? The case now seemed balanced on a knife's edge, with compelling arguments on both sides. That evening, alone in her home, Olivia pored over her notes from the trial, weighing the evidence with the detached analysis that had made her reputation as a fair judge. The prosecution had the victim's identification and the money found on Marcus. The defense had Rodriguez's testimony and Marcus's own account, plus the absence of the weapon or distinctive clothing described by the victim. If the jury found Marcus guilty, she would have to sentence him. The minimum for armed robbery in D. C was 5 years, but with the assault charge, it could go much higher. The thought of sending Marcus to prison, her Marcus, who had once taught her to skip stones and dream of a better world, made her physically ill. But if she let that history influence her, she would be betraying her oath as a judge. Justice had to be blind, even when it broke her heart. Sleep eluded her again that night. The courtroom was packed for closing arguments. Word had spread about the compelling testimony, and the gallery was filled with spectators, reporters, and even a few legal students taking notes. Reynolds went first, his closing statement polished and forceful. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the facts in this case are straightforward. A man entered Ali Nazari's store, threatened him with a knife, stole money, and injured him. Mr. Nazari positively identified Marcus Washington as that man. The police found Mr. Washington near the scene with the exact amount of stolen money in his possession." He paced before the jury box, making eye contact with each member. "The defense asks you to believe a convenient story about moving furniture and cash payments with no documentation. They ask you to disregard the victim's clear identification. They ask you to believe that multiple police officers are either mistaken or lying about where they apprehended the defendant." Reynolds paused, letting his words sink in. "Our criminal justice system is built on evidence, not excuses. The evidence in this case points to one conclusion. Marcus Washington committed this robbery. Mr. Nazari deserves justice. Our community deserves protection. I ask you to return a verdict of guilty on all counts." Chen rose next, her manner less theatrical, but equally passionate. "Members of the jury, this case is about more than just evidence. It's about how we interpret that evidence and what assumptions we bring to that interpretation." She moved to stand beside Marcus. "The prosecution's case rests on 3 pillars. An identification made under stress and poor lighting by a traumatized victim, money that has a legitimate explanation for being in my client's possession, and officers who decided Mr. Washington was guilty before they even spoke to him." As Chen approached the jury, "Think about what wasn't found on Mr. Washington. No knife, no hoodie as described by Mr. Nazari, no stolen credit cards or other items from the register, just cash that Mr. Rodriguez testified he paid to my client that very night. The prosecution asks you to find Mr. Washington guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but there is substantial doubt here. Doubt about the reliability of the identification, doubt about whether the police apprehended the right person, doubt fueled by the testimony of a respected business owner who places Mr. Washington miles from the scene just before the crime." Chen rested her hands on the rail of the jury box. "Marcus Washington has made mistakes in his past, as many of us have, but he has worked tirelessly to build a stable, honest life. He is not the man who robbed that store. I ask you to return the only just verdict. Not guilty on all counts." As Chen returned to her seat, Olivia addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the evidence and arguments in this case. It is now your duty to deliberate and reach a verdict. You must determine whether the prosecution has proven the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have a reasonable doubt, you must find the defendant not guilty. She continued with standard jury instructions about evaluating evidence, witness credibility, and the elements of the charged crimes. Throughout, Olivia maintained her judicial demeanor, her voice clear and neutral, betraying none of the conflict raging within her. The bailiff will now escort you to the jury room to begin your deliberations. We will reconvene when you have reached a verdict. As the jury filed out, Olivia noticed Marcus watching them intently, his future in their hands. She caught his eye for a brief moment, and something passed between them. Not a message, not even an acknowledgement of their shared past, but a simple human connection, a recognition that beneath the roles of judge and defendant, they were still the children who had skipped stones together in a park long ago. Olivia retreated to her chambers to await the verdict. She had no idea how long the jury would deliberate. It could be hours or days. Complex cases often took longer, but this one, despite its emotional weight, was relatively straightforward in terms of evidence. Rachel brought her lunch, which Olivia barely touched. The hours stretched on, the anxiety building. At 4:30 p.m., just as Olivia was beginning to think the jury would need to resume deliberations the next day, the bailiff knocked on her door. "They've reached a verdict, Your Honor." Olivia took a deep breath, smoothed her robe, and returned to the courtroom. Marcus was brought back in, followed by both attorneys. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Olivia asked the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and kind eyes. "We have, Your Honor." She handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to Olivia. Olivia read the verdict silently first, her face betraying nothing. She returned the paper to the bailiff, who handed it back to the foreperson. "The defendant will please rise," Olivia instructed. Marcus stood, Chen beside him. His expression was resigned but dignified, as if he had already accepted whatever was to come. "On the charge of armed robbery, how do you find?" "We find the defendant not guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Olivia tapped her gavel once. "On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, how do you find?" "Not guilty." "On the charge of resisting arrest, how do you find?" "Guilty." Olivia nodded. "The verdict is recorded. Mr. Washington, you have been found not guilty of armed robbery and assault, but guilty of resisting arrest. Sentencing for this misdemeanor offense will be scheduled for next week. You are released on your own recognizance until that time." The relief on Marcus's face was palpable. Chen squeezed his arm, whispering something that made him nod. Reynolds looked disappointed, but not surprised. He had to have recognized the weaknesses in his case by the end. "Court is adjourned," Olivia announced, tapping her gavel a final time. As people began to file out, Marcus remained at the defense table, seemingly overwhelmed by the moment. Reporters tried to approach him, but Chen waved them away, creating a protective barrier around her client. Olivia descended from the bench, intending to return to her chambers, but found herself hesitating. Protocol dictated that she leave immediately, avoiding any appearance of impropriety, but something stronger than protocol held her in place. She approached the defense table. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Washington," she acknowledged formally. "A word in my chambers, please." Chen looked surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." Once inside her chambers with the door closed, Olivia removed her robe and hung it carefully on its stand. When she turned back, Marcus was watching her with those same dark eyes that had once sparkled with dreams of the future. "I should have recused myself," she said simply. "I knew you a long time ago." Marcus nodded slowly. "I recognized you the moment I walked into the courtroom, Olivia." Chen looked bewildered. "You two know each other?" "Your Honor, if there was a conflict of interest—" "There was," Olivia admitted. "But I believed I could be impartial, and I feared that explaining a recusal would create a media circus that might prejudice the case." She looked directly at Marcus. "I'm sorry. It was a lapse in judgment." "You were fair," Marcus said quietly. "That's all I ever asked for." Olivia gestured for them to sit, taking a seat herself behind her desk. "The resisting arrest charge is minor. Time served would be the usual sentence, which means you wouldn't serve additional jail time." "It says, thank you, Your Honor," Chen said, still processing the revelation that her client and the judge had a history. "Not as a judge," Olivia continued, "but as someone who once knew you, Marcus. What happened? After that summer? After you moved away?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. Life happened, he finally said. My grandmother died, Mom got sick, bills piled up. I made some bad choices, fell in with people who didn't have my best interests at heart. It took me a long time to find my way back to the person I wanted to be. I looked for you, Olivia admitted, at the park for weeks after you left. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I wanted to say goodbye, but after your father, well, I figured it was better to make a clean break. My father, Olivia echoed, the old anger resurfacing. He was wrong, you know, about so many things. He was protecting his daughter, Marcus said with unexpected generosity. Can't fault a man for that, even if his methods were complicated. Complicated. Such a diplomatic way to describe the racism that had torn apart their childhood friendship. I became a judge because I wanted to change things, Olivia said, to make the system more just. But sometimes I wonder if I'm just another cog in a machine that keeps rolling over people like me, Marcus finished. Maybe. But today, the system worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. I'm free, even though I fit the profile that usually ends with a conviction. Chen, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Your Honor, I'm still not entirely clear on your connection to my client, but I should advise him not to discuss the case further until after sentencing. Olivia nodded. You're right, of course, and I've already overstepped. I just needed to acknowledge the past. The past is past, Marcus said, rising from his chair. What matters is what we do now. As they prepared to leave, Olivia found herself saying, Marcus, when this is officially over, after sentencing, maybe we could meet. Just to talk. As people, not as judge and defendant. Marcus studied her face, then nodded. I'd like that, Olivia. There's a coffee shop near the park. Still know how to skip stones? For the first time in days, Olivia smiled genuinely. I might be a little rusty. That's okay, he said, a flash of the boy he'd been shining through. I remember how to teach you. Epilogue, 6 months later. Meridian Hill Park hadn't changed much in nearly 4 decades. The trees were taller, the pathways more worn, but the cascading fountain still flowed in rhythmic tears, and the same stone benches offered rest to visitors. Olivia and Marcus sat on one such bench, coffee cups in hand, watching children play near the water. They'd been meeting here every few weeks since Marcus's case concluded, rebuilding a friendship that had been interrupted all those years ago. Marcus had received time served for the resisting arrest charge as Olivia had predicted. He'd returned to his job at Rodriguez Auto Repair, where business was booming thanks partly to the publicity from the trial. He'd recently been promoted to shop manager and was saving to open his own garage someday. Olivia had faced her own consequences. An anonymous tip to the Judicial Review Board about her undisclosed relationship with the defendant had triggered an investigation. She'd been forthright about her lapse in judgment, and while she'd received a formal reprimand, she'd retained her position on the bench. The experience had been humbling, but clarifying. I've been thinking about what you said, Marcus remarked, breaking a comfortable silence. About being a cog in the machine. And, Olivia prompted, even machines can be repaired, improved, redesigned, but you need people on the inside who understand how they work. Olivia considered this. True, but sometimes I feel like I'm just applying band-aids when what we need is major surgery. So do more, Marcus challenged. You're a respected judge now. You have influence, platforms most people don't. I've been thinking about that, Olivia admitted. I've been invited to join a commission on bail reform, and I'm considering teaching a course at Georgetown Law on implicit bias in the courtroom. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's a start. What about you? Olivia asked. Still planning to open your own shop? Yeah, but I'm thinking bigger now. I want to create an apprenticeship program for kids from neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. Teach them a trade, give them options besides the streets. Olivia smiled. You always did want to help people. Remember what you told me that summer about starting a business that makes things better? I can't believe you remember that, Marcus said, shaking his head in wonder. I remember a lot of things, Olivia replied softly, like how to skip stones. She reached down and picked up a flat stone from beside the bench, turning it over in her palm. What was it you always said? It's all in the wrist? And you need the right stone, Marcus added, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Flat, but with some weight to it. They walked to the edge of the fountain. Olivia drew back her arm and, with a fluid motion that surprised even herself, sent the stone skipping across the water 1, 2, 3 times before it sank. "Not bad," Marcus approved. "You've been practicing." "No," Olivia corrected him. "I just had a good teacher." They stood there together, judge and mechanic, no longer separated by the bench that had briefly defined their relationship. Just two friends, reconnected by chance and choice, both committed in their own ways to making the ripples from their lives spread outward in circles of positive change. Behind them, the city hummed with its endless complications, its injustices and possibilities. Before them, children played near the water, oblivious to the barriers that would one day try to define and divide them. And between these realities, Olivia and Marcus stood together, wisdom in their eyes and flat stones in their hands, ready to make whatever small difference they could in the ongoing work of justice and recognition.